now we need to see where that verse comes in this one continuous story. So what happens before God says it's not good for man to be alone? Tell me what happens. Well, God sets up a parade. Right? In order to answer that question, God sets up a parade. But before he raises that question, God does one really, really important thing. He puts the man in the garden, and then he says, hey, have a good time. I'll see you next year. Is that what he says? What does he say? He gives him one commandment. One. One and only one commandment to determine the purpose of the man. Okay? What is the one commandment? Tell me exactly what it says, because the variation of it will be really important. Okay? What does it say exactly? Well, you're going to tell me in English. That's okay.
Do not touch the tree.
It says, what does it say? What's the one commandment?
You must not eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge.
Okay, but that isn't the beginning of the commandment. The beginning of the commandment is, of all the trees of the garden of the garden, you may freely eat. Right?
Yeah.
Right? The first part of the commandment is the liberation of God, the liberty that he gives him. You can eat of anything in the garden. In fact, in Hebrew it says akatokel. It means you can feast. It literally means you can eat. Okay? So when you thought you were full, have another meal. Right? It's double eating. So of all the trees of the garden, you can double eat, except the one tree in the garden. Of that tree, when you eat of it, you shall, it says mut, you shall surely die. Okay? One commandment. Okay? The one commandment starts with eat, and ends with die. I mean, that's the way Hebrew does things, because it doesn't have exclamation points. If it had an exclamation point, it would just put it after eat and after die. Okay? So, the one commandment says you can eat of everything in the garden. Feast yourself, delight. God doesn't say, and gluttony is a sin. He says, go eat. Except for this one tree. Now, have you ever noticed the fact that the commandment is a dietary one? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
The one and only commandment that God gives Adam is about what to eat and what not to eat. Do you suppose that God might be interested in what we eat and what we don't eat? I mean, obviously he told Adam what to eat and what not to eat, right? Why would he do that? Why doesn't God say, of all the places in the garden you can go, you can explore everywhere, but reminded of the one and only commandment that God has? In other words, you never leave the thought of what God has asked you not to do out of your consciousness, because you get hungry. And every time you get hungry, you think, oh, you know what? God said I can eat all of this stuff, but not that one. Every single time I eat, I think of the commandment of God. Okay? Why is that important? Because it reminds you of who God is and who you are every single time. Right? It isn't possible. I mean, you can try fasting for a while, but at some point you're going to have to decide that you need to eat. And eating is a method by which you survive. It becomes absolutely critical for the continuance of life. And so God attaches a commandment to something that you do all the time and that you must do in order to live. Right? Interesting, huh? He could have chosen anything, but he chooses these, I think, for some very specific reasons. Okay. Now, after he gives the commandment, guess what? He says, after he gives the commandment, it's not good for man to be alone. So, here's what the man has. One animal is a perfect relationship with his environment. But there's something that's not right about that. And we talked about the need for self-awareness, but there's something else attached to that. That is, that God says it's not good for him to be alone because there's a commandment to keep. And he needs someone who he can learn to be in voluntary submission to, so that he understands how to keep the commandment. Because a commandment is a process of voluntary submission. Right? In other words, God recognizes that what's missing from Adam is not just self-awareness, but the practice of learning to submit to another so that he can keep the commandment as well. Right? Now here's a really interesting thing. The knowledge of the tree of good and evil cannot be about what is right and wrong. Because if it's about what is right and wrong and Adam hasn't eaten of it, he wouldn't know the difference between keeping the commandment and not keeping the commandment. He has to know the difference between right and wrong before the commandment makes any sense, right? In other words, you can't tell your child, by the way, I don't want you to have anything to do with that can of cookies over there, unless he knows that what you mean is he's not supposed to have any of the cookies, right? You can't give him a commandment that he doesn't understand. So you can't give Adam a commandment about not eating of the tree if right and wrong means that he has to have what is in the tree. The only difference that you're giving him is you're telling him, you know what the difference between right and wrong is. What God says is right, and what God says is wrong. And by the way, the prophets say exactly the same thing. Micah says, what is good, O man? God has told you. So God tells you what's right, and he tells you what's wrong. The issue is whether or not you're going to practice exactly what God says. That's the issue. It's not an issue of not knowing right and wrong. It's an issue of whether or not you're going to do it. Okay? That's really important because of what Eve, Ahavah, does. Okay, so now we have the commandment. Now God says he needs a Nazir Kenegdo. And here it is. God talks about Adam as Adam. Adam talks about the woman as Isha. Adam eventually names the woman Ahavah. But in the meantime, God uses two words, Ezer Kenegdo, to describe what he's going to provide the man. Okay? And these are the most important and most difficult words that you're going to find in this story. Okay? Here's the problem. We know what the word Ezer means because God uses it of himself. It comes from the verb azar, and it means, we have some of it there. It means a helper, one who gives aid, one who encourages, one who supports, one who protects, and it's closely tied to the idea of salvation. In other words, what God says is, I am the Ezer of Israel. So what does that mean? What does God do for Israel? He protects, he provides, he nourishes, he sustains. You ready for this, Craig Adam? He chastises, he punishes. Okay? And Ezer does those things. Okay? So that means that when I have an Ezer Kenegdo, I have someone who does what God does. That's what a human being does, right? That's what a man does. A man or a woman does what God does. What does God do? He sustains, he provides, he protects, he nourishes, he chastises, he punishes. So in other words, when she says to you, I don't think you should be doing that. That's the voice of God in your ear, sitting in the house with you, telling you that this is something she's been designed to do to remind you when you are not living according to God's plan. Okay? When you go ahead anyway, she punishes you. Right? And the reason she does that is because that's what God does. Right? So God says to Adam, you know what? I know it's difficult for you as a man to keep this commandment, so I'm going to put myself in bodily form right there next to you, so that every time you think about the commandment, she'll be right there to remind you. Right? And then it says how God made the Ezer Kenegdo. And this is what he did. It doesn't use the same words for Adam, by the way. He doesn't breathe the breath of life into a worthless pile of dust. What he does is he takes a piece of Adam, right? Self-identity. He takes a piece of Adam, and from the piece of Adam, he constructs the woman. And the verb that it uses there is to build with a blueprint in mind, a purpose. It's a purpose-built thing. So God does this. He thinks about what this woman's supposed to be doing, what her purposes are, how she's supposed to function, how she's supposed to live in the world, how her relationships are going to go. And then he builds her exactly for that purpose. It's like custom designed software. Right? She was custom designed to do exactly what God wants her to do. Now here's the interesting thing. Takes the piece out of Adam, right? We call it the rib, but it's not really the rib. The word means the side. Takes the side out of Adam. The rabbis say he didn't take it from the head because she is not above him. He didn't take it from the foot because she's not below him. He took it from the side because she's equal to him. Okay? So he takes the side. Where's Adam when all this happens? More than sleeping. The Hebrew word means to be in a deep trance from which you cannot wake up. Right? Adam is anesthetized. He went into surgery. You know, God gave him a little shot, said count backwards from 10. He went 10, 9, gone. And when he wakes up, there she is. Oh, amazing. What a great surgery that was. Okay? The whole point is, he has nothing to do with the creation of the woman. Zero. Nada. Not a thing. He doesn't contribute one single iota to the plan or to the construction. Right? The only thing he does is provide some material. All right? Why is that important? Because the covenant relationship that she has is not with the man. He's dead out asleep. The covenant relationship is with God.
Oh, that's good.
Right? I'll give you a parallel. In Hebrew, there are lots of parallels, and they depend on using the same vocabulary in different circumstances. There's another circumstance just like this, where a person is completely dead asleep, and something happens while he's asleep so that when he wakes up, he's the beneficiary of it. Can you imagine what that is? It's in the Genesis account. Abraham. God wants to make a covenant. Does he want to make the covenant with Abraham? No, because he knows Abraham can't keep the covenant. So he wants to make the covenant with himself. But Abraham does all the preparation work. Abraham provides the material. Right? He slices up the animals, he puts the da-da-da. And then guess what happens? Does Abraham contribute to the covenant? Not at all. Abraham goes into a trance. The same word. He's completely and utterly out of it. He has zero to do with the actual covenant. The covenant that God makes is with himself. And when Abraham wakes up, guess what? He's the beneficiary of that covenant. It's exactly what happens with Adam. When he wakes up, he gets all the benefit, and he had nothing to do with the construction. Okay? Which means, and you thought it was going to be, you thought you had the obligation because you had to walk down the aisle, and it's up to you to make the dynamics of the relationship work, and on and on and on and on. Nothing has to happen to her, right? Which means that she carries the following burden. She is hardwired to know what it is that God wants for the relationship between the two of you and what you should be doing in the purposes of your life in order to delight God. She's hardwired for that. And her job is to make sure that that's all she communicates. Because it's easy for her to communicate what she wants as well. All right. Your job is relatively simple. You just have to listen. Her job is to make sure that she's listening to the one that she has a covenant with. Okay? All right. So now we're going to look at, that's Ezer, right? Helper. It's not like domestic servant, somebody that I hire to do the dishes. It's vital to the relationship that I have with God because she understands intuitively. We call it women's intuition. But in fact, it's God hardwiring her to be the relationship manager in life so that she understands how the relationships work, particularly the relationship with God, so that she can communicate that to her man so that he will say, "Thank you for helping me see this. I'm so glad you're in my life because now I know what God wants." Okay? Right? Every time the man says, "Yeah, but that isn't what God is telling me," you might as well put a gun to your head and see it. Boom. Because you just missed the point. He hardwired her for that role, not you. He hardwired you for a different kind of role. Okay? So, let's go look at kenegdo now. Remember, it's not just ezer. That's the word for God. It's ezer kenegdo. So now let's look at kenegdo and see how kenegdo modifies this idea of ezer so that we can see how God designed this. Okay? All right. So we know that you're the ezer, but we also want to know why you're the ezer kenegdo. Okay? So I'm going to borrow you two again. Please come forward. By the time we're done, you will actually be Adam and Eve. Okay, so here's the way. Now you have to stand over here with me. He's standing over here, see, because he's figured out that his identity depends on you. Okay, and he's self-aware of who he is because of you. Okay, now ezer means helper, but kenegdo is the combination of two prepositions. Two prepositions that mean exactly the opposite. One preposition means to go toward. The other preposition means to go away. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go toward him and away from him at the same time. It's difficult, isn't it? You can't do it. Right. And so the rabbis say, what's this with this word already? Right? I can't figure out what this word means because it means to go toward and away at the same time. And along comes Maimonides in the 10th century and he says, but here's what it means. When he's doing what God wants him to do, you go toward him. When he's not doing what God wants him to do, you go away from him. Now the reason that God set it up like that is because basically men are stupid. Right? And what he said is, this man needs help. So I'm going to put a helper in his life who all he has to do is see which direction she's going and he'll know if he's on track. In other words, when she's coming toward you and drawing closer to you and you're feeling more and more and more the deepness of your love, you are on track. When you are not doing what you're supposed to do and you see the backside of her moving away from you, you are not on track. Which means that she is the red light, green light in your life. If it's red, you better get on the track. If it's green, go for it. Right? And that makes it really simple for a man, doesn't it? Because all he's got to do is stand over here and see which way you're going. Isn't that easy? You couldn't imagine that your marriage would be so simple that all you have to do is just see if she's green or red. And you'll know what to do. Right?
The wrong book on that.
Okay, thank you. You're done. Oh, wait a minute, but you're not. Okay? Because here's the problem. Even though it's really obvious for a man to, there isn't a man alive who doesn't know when things are getting better or worse. Right? At least God hardwired us for that. We're not colorblind. Right? We can actually tell the difference between green and red. Okay? In fact, we can even anticipate the difference between green and red. That's the important thing. But here's the hard job that she has. The only time that she can be green and red is when she knows what God wants for you. Because it's not red because you don't like it. It's red because you know that God doesn't like it. So your job is to be so in tune with God that you only show him the green and red light in accordance with what God wants. Okay? That's Ezer Kenegdo. Thank you. All right? Three helps us see, remember I told you that there's no chapters, no verse numbers, so the story is continuous. So something happens at the end of chapter 2 that carries right over into chapter 3 that you would never see in English. So I'm going to explain to you what happens in Hebrew as soon as we look at the summation of what's happened in chapter 2. Right? What's happened in chapter 2 is this. Remember I told you that in the Hebraic account of creation, it's the only ancient Middle Eastern text that provides for the creation of woman. Right? The only one. All the rest of them are man, 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 and women are just property. But in Hebrew, women are not only is there a story about the creation of women, there's also the fact that the creation of woman is the last thing that God does. And what that means essentially is this. The ultimate act of creation of God is in the woman, not in the man. Right? The woman is the last thing that God does. It's sort of like the magnum opus, the final example of what God's doing in his creative activity comes because of the woman. So, we would expect and we find that the rabbis note that because she's the last thing in creation, she's also the pinnacle of what God does and the best representation of what it means to be created by him. In fact, the rabbis argue that because woman comes from man and not from the dust, she's the first truly human person. Man is half dirt. Everybody knows that. The woman, however, is 100% human material, right? God breathed into 100% human material to make the woman. So, she is of a different kind of order than the man, not ontologically different. They both have equal status in front of God, but the role that she plays is very different than the role that the man plays. She has a special covenant relationship with God. She was built on purpose by God, and now she turns out to be the pinnacle of God's creation. In addition to which, if we look at the vocabulary, we'll find that the words that are used for the creation of woman also show up in royal language. So she's actually created as a princess, as a queen, as somebody who represents, you're liking that, as somebody who represents the very best that God could do, right? And so at the end of the day, what the rabbis say is, woman has an entitlement to humanity that man did not receive at creation. In fact, the rabbis go on to say that a man without a woman diminishes the earth. Right? They view that creative process as so important, so distinctive, that it makes a difference to the entire earth when a man tries to live his life without a woman. Okay? So, now that we have that in mind, yes?
So I'm jumping ahead, but aren't there scriptures that say, I was just talking about this, scriptures that say that God calls some people to not marry?
Yes, and we're going to see what Paul has to say about that when we get to the apostolic writings.
Okay.
Because there are some people who are single on purpose, but that's not the intention. Right? Okay, so now let's see what happened. In order to understand the purposes that God used in the blueprint, we have this. That she was made to bless her man with God as her model, right? So she blesses him in the same way that God would bless him. In other words, she doesn't bless him based on her agenda. She blesses him based on God's agenda. She was designed to take ownership. Now, most men don't have a real good feel about that. The last thing they want to do is think that their wives own them. But they have forgotten that the way that she takes ownership is according to the way that God would take ownership, not the way that you could project her as taking ownership, right? So it's unlikely she's going to bring out the whips and chains. It's more likely that in her prayer life she will be asking, Father, what do you want me to communicate to my husband so that he may do the things that you really want in his life, right? It's a different kind of ownership. And in fact, there's a verse in Song of Songs that we're going to talk about that specifically talks about ownership. And we'll get to that one in a minute, okay? She's not subordinate but complementary. In other words, Ish Isha. I cannot be Ish without Isha. I don't exist as an Ish, as the dynamic of all those relationships without her. I have to have her in order to understand who I am, right? And she's necessary to achieve the dual purpose. In other words, we saw in Genesis 1:26 and 27 that he created them, both male and female, with the prime directive. She has exactly the same prime directive, to multiply, to fill the earth, to subdue, to take dominion. Those things haven't changed. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. There's no glass ceiling in heaven, right? God treats the ontological status of both exactly the same. She has exactly the same prime directive that I do, right? Which is to provide, is to expand the garden borders so that the Garden of Eden takes over the whole planet. That's her prime directive. How she goes about doing that is different than the way I go about doing that, and we'll see that also in Song of Songs when we talk about, we'll see that in Proverbs when we talk about the poetry of Proverbs 31. Okay? The only difference between the two of them, and it's an important difference, is the functional one. So that you see that the man has a specific job, remember, to work, worship, and serve, and the woman has a specific job to encourage, to nourish, to provide, to sustain, to protect, to chastise, and to punish in relation to the work, worship, and serving that the man does, right? The two work hand in glove, okay? And finally, of course, you can't accomplish what you're supposed to do under God's provision without the other. You just can't do it. Now, as Rachel pointed out, there are exceptions to the rule. And those exceptions are the people that God calls to single life for a specific purpose. But it's not the intention. God intends you to be in relationships so that self-identity becomes self-awareness, and that awareness leads to two people on the same page declaring the same Echad Basar, the same proclamation of the unity of the Father. Okay? So, we got all that? We got the design? You see how God set it up? Great, now we'll see what happened. Because it turned out to be a disaster. Not because of what God designed, but because of something else. Okay? And that's into the serpent. Alright, so who are the actors in Genesis chapter 3? Just tell me who they are.
Adam, Eve, and the serpent.
Adam and Eve and the serpent, and
God.
And God. Right, okay? So, the story begins, however, with a conversation between the serpent and Ahavah, right? Eve, okay? But actually the story doesn't begin there. The story begins in the last verse of the 2nd chapter, right? Because in the last verse of the 2nd chapter it says, and they were naked and not ashamed. Now what's really interesting is, the word for naked in Hebrew is exactly the same word that's used for crafty when it describes the serpent. In other words, you won't see it in English because the next verse says, and the serpent was the craftiest of all the creatures of the field. The word crafty is the same word that's used for naked. Why? What does crafty have to do with naked? And the answer was provided by Rabbi David Foreman, who said, don't you see that the word naked is not about no clothes, it's about transparency. In other words, when it says they were naked and not ashamed, it means they didn't have any hidden agendas. But the serpent has hidden agenda. Therefore, he is the opposite of naked. Naked means you see through me. You see who I am. I don't hide anything. Crafty means you think you see through me, but I actually have something hidden. Okay? I need that connection between Genesis 2, the last verse, and Genesis 3, the first verse, in order to see that the story that I'm about to tell you is not about clothes. It's about transparency. It's about what I portray on the outside, different from what happens on the inside. Okay? So, now let's back up. We have that. You got that picture now? You can't see it in English. You only see it in Hebrew, but there it is. It's a rum and a ram, the two Hebrew words, okay? It's the same word with different vowels. All right? So now you have that picture. Now we'll look at the serpent story and see why that's so important, okay? And here's what happens in the serpent story. So tell me how the story begins.
He asks a question.
Oh, but he doesn't ask a question in Hebrew.
He makes a statement, sorry.
Yeah, he makes a statement in Hebrew. In English it says that the serpent was basically strolling along one day. By the way, what kind of a serpent is this? He walks, he talks, he obviously has cunning plans, he anticipates, he has rational abilities. Not anything like any serpent I've ever met. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to meet a black mamba anytime soon in South Africa, but I don't suspect that the black mamba will actually talk to me before it tries to kill me. Okay? My guess is that the serpent that is in Genesis chapter 3 looks a lot more like a human being than a snake. Right? I mean, that's pretty much, yes?
Because I'm in the Garden of Eden, it does spoke to each other spiritually.
I'm sorry?
It does spoken to each other spiritually rather than physically.
Okay. You'll have to forgive the fact that I speak American English, and so I'm going to have a very hard time deciphering the accent. You'll have to help me.
Would they have spoken spiritually?
Would they have spoken spiritually?
Rather than just naturally?
Okay, so this is an interesting question about, Pardes, the acronym Pardes, right? The Pashat, which is the literal meaning of the text, right? The Remez, the Daresh, and the Sod, right? So Pardes suggests that they spoke to each other. In other words, it's not spiritually, because that would add a level of the text that isn't present in the text, right? The text simply says that the serpent came along and said to her, God said, right? Now, the interesting thing is, what does the serpent agree to when he says God said? He's talking about the commandment, right?
Yeah,
The one and only commandment, okay? And Eve repeats the commandment, okay? But does Eve actually repeat the commandment?
She adds something.
She adds something, okay? What does she add?
That you may not touch it.
You may not touch it, right. When did she decide to add that? She was just strolling along one day and she thought, I'll just add that. Is that what happened?
No.
Where did Eve get the commandment? From Adam. Adam was the one who was given the commandment, and the only way that Eve knows what the commandment is if the husband repeated the commandment to her and told her what it was, right? So who added and not touch it?
Must be Adam then.
Must be Adam.
Could it have been Adam or could it have been Eve? In the sense that he said no.
You wait and see what happens. Wait and see what happens. So here's Adam, right? And Adam, God comes along and says, by the way, Adam, there's only one commandment that you have to remember. Of all the trees of the garden you may freely eat. In fact, you can eat. In fact, have a few, right? Stuff yourself. But of that one tree you may not eat, and the day that you eat of it, you'll surely die, right? And Adam now has an Isha in his life, right? And he realizes, my goodness, God gave me the Isha so that I would be reminded to keep the one commandment that will keep everything working the way it's supposed to in the garden, in everything and perfect in life. But what happens? What happens if she gets tempted to break the commandment? If I tell her that she can't touch it, then there's no way that she'll get close to eating it. Right? In other words, I'll build a fence around the Torah. I will just expand the commandment a little bit with the idea that because she doesn't know any different. She only knows what you're going to tell her that God said. So you just tell her, and God said that you couldn't touch it. And then she realizes, my goodness, I must not even get close to that thing, because if by accident I happen to brush by it, I'll touch it and break the commandment. So I'm going to keep my distance, which is exactly what you want, because you're only saying that to her to make sure that nothing ever comes across her path that might actually cause her to think about eating it. And if she can't even touch it, then she'll stay far away. So you do it for good reasons, right? You're trying to protect her from what you know God doesn't want, which is to eat it, but you just add a little bit to it to make it a little stronger to keep her away. Thinking, of course, that she needs you to add that for her commandment, because after all, you're supposed to be taking care of her, and so if you just add a little bit to what God said, you'll make sure that she doesn't make any mistakes. Right? Isn't that the way it works? Yes?
If they're fully transparent.
Thank you. Because all of a sudden, there's something that isn't fully transparent. And what isn't fully transparent is the addition of the commandment that God didn't say. Right? Just that little tiny bit. Yes?
Is it not that she actually takes that, so he says don't eat it. She thinks maybe we should make it not touch it.
Wait, because you need the rest of the story to see why that can't be the case. Okay? So, he's done what he thinks is the right thing to keep her away, in order that she will act in the role that she's supposed to and never even get close to it. Okay? And what happened? Thank you very much. You did a good job. Unfortunately, you'll see what happens. Okay, so what happens is this. She repeats what he told her. By the way, this is what the rabbis teach too. Okay? She repeats what he told her. And what he told her, of course, has the additional piece in it. Okay? So, now we need Eve. And she thinks that she's repeating what God said because this is what Adam told her. And so I'm going to be the serpent now because I like to play the bad guy. So I come along and I say, God said. And she says, yes, that's right. I'm so glad you agree with me. God said that we may eat of all the trees in the garden except the one in the, and she uses midst of the garden. That's an important clue. Because for Ahavah, for Eve, the tree, which is not in the midst of the garden, it's just in the garden, becomes the focus of her attention. And it's the focus of her attention because it's the only one that she can't get close to. Right? And so all of a sudden she says the tree in the midst of the garden, we may not touch it or eat of it lest we die. Now the serpent, who already has agreed that this is what God says, does this. We need a tree. This will do. You, by the way, are standing far away from the tree. So even if you reached out with your arm, you couldn't possibly touch it. So what does the serpent say? That's interesting. Nothing happens. Nothing happens to him. Oh, maybe I didn't touch it enough. Oh, nothing happened. Oh my goodness. Do you mean God told you something that wasn't true? Look, I'm not dying. Nothing's happening to me at all. And here's the interesting thing. According to the Hebrew text, Adam is standing right next to her. So here's the problem Adam has now.
He's busted.
He's busted. Right. Here's the problem. He's standing right here. Actually, you're not standing between.
Okay.
You're standing on the other side because I'm next to her because the serpent knows what he's doing. And what he does is this. Really simple. He says, nothing happened to me. Now, Adam knows that God didn't say not to touch it. So he knows that the serpent can touch it and nothing will happen to him. But what is he going to do? Is he going to say to his Ezer Kenegdo, oh yeah, by the way, I just added that piece, right? In which case he will admit that he actually lied to her about what God said. In which case he will be humiliated and shamed because he told her something that wasn't true about what God said. What does he do instead? He says nothing because he's hoping beyond hope that things will still work out somehow and he won't be caught, right? And then when she looks and sees that the serpent can touch it and nothing happens, what's the next obvious thing? Well, God must not have told me the truth. In which case, eating of it won't make any difference either, right? Now, it's at this point that Adam should be screaming up and down, no, that's not what God said. But if as soon as he says that, he ruins the apparent transparency that existed between the two of them, right? Now he has to admit that he had some secret. And that will change forever the relationship between the two of them. So he says nothing. And he allows her to go forward, even to the point of eating the fruit and giving it to him, because now he's in an impossible bind. He either takes the fruit from her and keeps her, or he refuses the fruit and she dies and he's left alone again. Didn't work out so good for you, did it?
Nope.
It sure didn't. And it's actually, there's a step. So the people who tell you, well, it's all Eve's fault because she committed the sin, forget that he started the whole process. And wait a minute, not quite. Because there's one step behind that that's in the text that we don't see in English. And that is, what's her role?
To God.
Her role is to do what God says and to advise him, right? That means that he is the one who should have responded to the serpent, not her. Because he is the one who, the word is zakar, it's the word for male in Hebrew, but it also means to remember. He is the one who is charged with remembering exactly what God said. So the second the serpent agrees that it included touching, he's supposed to stand up and say, not a chance. Okay? In other words, he allows her to usurp the role that she had. In other words, she took over the role. And when the serpent came to you, you should have said, talk to my husband. But instead you said, oh, I'll handle this for you, honey. Don't worry, I can take care of this. I'm the Ezer Kenegdo, and I'll just step into the role that you should have had, which was about remembering what God said, and I'll take that burden off of you. Now, I don't know how many times this happens in your marriage, but it seems to me that a lot of us step into the other person's role and take that responsibility on when we should have left it alone and let them deal with what it is that God wanted them to deal with. Right? You have a role. Your role is to remember exactly what God said and to keep that in front of you at all times. Her role is not to remember what God said. Her role is to advise you on how what God said applies to you. Okay? So, she takes over the role of remembering what God said. And why does she do that? Because the serpent is not stupid, people. He knows that she is the Ezer Kenegdo. So if he can get her to agree, guess what he's going to do? Follow right along behind, like the little puppy dog. Right? And in fact, that's exactly what Adam claims. When it all falls apart, what does he say? It wasn't my fault, it was her fault. And it was your fault, God, because you made her wrong, or she wouldn't have led me astray. That's what he says, remember? He says, it's you who sent the woman to me, remember? So he blames her and God. At least you're smart enough now not to blame God. You just blame the serpent, right? Okay, but you see what happens? There isn't the sin of her eating and handing it off to her husband. There's the sin of silence, the sin of not remembering what God said and not saying anything about it. There's the sin of changes of role play. There's a sin of all of those things going on in the background that creates the environment that the serpent capitalizes on. Okay, thanks very much. I'm sorry that you ended up in such a mess. Okay? So, if the church teaches you that Eve is the one who brought sin into the world, it's dead wrong. And Paul doesn't teach that either, by the way. Paul says that she was seduced, but Adam sinned deliberately. And what he means, of course, is that the commandment was given to Adam, and he chose not to do anything about it. Whereas she thought she was doing what God asked. Right? She was seduced by the serpent. Adam knew what was going on and didn't do anything. Right? In this case, being silent is the equivalent of causing all the disaster. So, interestingly enough, in Hebrew, as I've said many times, Hebrew's words have double meanings. And in Hebrew, the word for male is zakar, and it means both male and to remember. The word for female is nekavah, and it means both to female and a boundary that goes around like the boundary of a necklace. Okay? So in my view, what this teaches me is that a man is charged, just as Adam was charged, with remembering exactly what God said and not adding anything to it or taking anything away from it. And that's what Moses said, right? He says, listen, this is the instruction of the Lord, and you are not to add to it or take away from it. That's what I'm supposed to do as a man. I'm supposed to know God's word so well that I can tell you precisely what God says. And a woman is to set the fence. So all the serpent does is just encourage her to move the fence just a little bit, so that the tree is inside instead of outside. Yes?
Does that word sakar for the male to remember, is that the same word for the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath? Do you know?
Yeah, probably.
So is there a significance between?
Yeah, of course. The idea of remembering is tied to the role that Adam played and the role that God intended for the man. Right? But it can't be done independently of the application, can it? It's no good for me to just remember the words if I don't know how they apply. Right? Okay, so we have that much of the story? So now we have to see what happens after this. Sin then disrupts the created order by establishing a false hierarchy. What I mean is this. Let's pay attention now to what happens to the curses. Okay? So tell me who gets cursed.
The earth
The earth and
and the serpent.
the serpent. Are Adam and Eve cursed?
No.
Important.
Not yet.
At first they're hiding.
Not
Hiding
yet.
First.
Not yet. Let's wait. Okay? You're right, they're hiding. They don't get kicked out of the garden until we have this really strange verse about if they're allowed to partake of the tree of life. Okay? Really odd verse. That, by the way, depends on Egyptian mythology. But we can fill that in later. Okay? I mean, look, the story is written for people who came out of Egypt, right? So you'd expect Egyptian mythology to be in the story because that's what they knew, right? In fact, if we had time and we could go through all the Genesis account, I could show you where all kinds of Egyptian ideas are in the Genesis account because it was written to people who knew Egypt, okay? But let's just pay attention to what happens in this little story right here. So, what happens after they sin? You're right, the first thing that they do is hide. Interesting. So God comes along and he's walking in the cool of the evening and he says,
Ask, where is Adam? Where are you?
he says, where are you? Now in Hebrew there are two words for where. One is ifo, like where is Isaiah Street? Ifo Rehov Yeshayahu, right? Where is Isaiah Street? You'd be walking on the street in Jerusalem and you don't know where Isaiah Street is, and you come up to somebody and you say in Hebrew, Ifo Rehov Yeshayahu. Where is Isaiah Street? Geographical location, okay? The other word is not about geography. The other word means where in the sense of surprise. So, God doesn't ask where Adam is geographically. Do you suppose God doesn't know where Adam is? Of course he knows where he is. You know what he asks? Where are you? Like, why aren't you here where you're supposed to be with me? It's exactly the same word that Isaac uses when he says to his father, here's the wood and here's the knife, where is the sacrifice? Right? Like it's a surprise. What happened? We don't have the sacrifice, okay? So when God asks, where are you of Adam, he's not asking for geography. He's asking, how come Adam isn't fulfilling the expectations that God has, namely that they will walk together in the cool of the evening like they always have, okay? What is Adam's, do we get this now? Okay. What is Adam's response?
He's hiding.
I'm hiding. Why?
He's not making it.
Well, not exactly. That's not exactly what he says. And remember, we have to know exactly what he says in order to understand what the text is trying to teach us. Okay? So go take a look at Genesis chapter 3 and find the verse where Adam responds to God when he says, "Where are you?" and tell me exactly what it says. Because if you think about it, the way he responds is not what you expect. Yes? What does it say?
I heard your voice in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself.
Right. Except in Hebrew it doesn't say that. In Hebrew it says, I heard your voice in the garden and I am afraid. Not I was afraid. I am afraid. Now you would expect him to say this. I am afraid because I sinned. But that's not what he says at all. What does he say? I am afraid because I am naked. Right? Which elicits the question, who told you were naked? Now, remember what I said about the word naked? The word naked means transparent and not transparent, but pretending to be so. So what does Adam actually say? He says, I am afraid. Present, it's not I was afraid. I am afraid. Right now I'm in fear. What is he in fear of? God?
Because he's not sure what to
Now
expect.
losing.
He's afraid, he's in fear of the fact that he is no longer transparent. He has suddenly realized that there is another him inside that can be something that isn't on the outside. In other words, he's become the snake. He is now the naked serpent. The one who looks like he's okay on the outside, but there's something really wrong on the inside. Okay? That's why he is afraid. And that's why he is naked. Because it has nothing to do with clothes. It has everything to do with the fact that he now has a second agenda inside. For the first time he realizes that it's possible for him to portray one image on the outside and another in the inside, and that's exactly what the serpent did. Okay? Right. Why wouldn't he be afraid? All of his life, he's experienced what it means to be true. And now he realizes that he isn't. Yes?
Can I ask then, just from what you said there about he just realized that he is like the serpent.
Yeah.
Was he the serpent in the first place? He would have been walking with Eve at the same time and said, and that's when it could have actually been him in the first place.
Oh, that's very
Then
interesting.
she ate, and then he ate.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I never thought about that. I'll have to take a look and investigate. It's a very interesting idea.
The other,
Yes.
the other thought that's given me is that could that be the way that Lucifer, who was perhaps once transparent, became this thing that
Yeah,
is just
yes, it's possible, but there's nothing in the text, the Peshat, that suggests that the serpent is in any way some sort of spiritual creature, some sort of, angelic being, etc. Right? We add all that later. I mean, even the messianic prophecy, it shall bite you on the heel and you shall crush its head. There's nothing in the Peshat that suggests that that's a messianic prophecy. It's only after the fact that we look back and say, oh, you see, that's the first messianic prophecy. But as far as the original audience was concerned, I can't see any reason to believe that the original audience ever thought that. And I can't even see any reason why the original audience would have ever thought that the serpent was identified with Satan in any way. Right? Because as far as the original audience is concerned, what is the symbol of the serpent for people who've just come out of Egypt? Pharaoh. Right? The evil power of Pharaoh. I mean, he has the cobra headdress, right? So their association with the idea of serpent is the power of Pharaoh. Okay? By the way, that's power over life and death. And that becomes critical in understanding what the cross is about, because Yeshua himself refers to the story of Moses lifting up the serpent in the wilderness as an explanation of what happens on the cross. Okay? So, all that aside, let's go back to, for the first time he realizes that he himself has taken on the attributes of the serpent. Okay? And what does he do in order to compensate for that?
Who told you you are naked?
Well, that's what God says. But what does Adam do in order to compensate for his fear of being naked?
He was hiding.
He hides and he does something else.
Flowers. With the
He
leaves.
makes clothes of aprons of,
Fig leaves.
I wish it was fig
whatever,
leaves.
yeah.
It wouldn't have helped
Well,
much if it was
whatever
fig
it was
leaves.
that time.
Right, but the interesting thing is that those words are Babylonian, borrowed from Babylonian ideas, and the Babylonian idea for the fig leaf is actually a belt. It's a belt that was worn by warriors after battles to demonstrate the victory and the status and honor that they had. In other words, it was a belt of pride. So what Adam does, according to the Genesis text, is try to cover himself with pride. And how does he do that? By blaming her. Right? He defers his guilt by being prideful and pushing the guilt off onto her. Okay? And then he says, it's not my fault, it's her fault, and it's the fault of the woman you gave me. In other words, it's your fault, God. There was a design flaw. And if you had just designed her differently, she wouldn't have let this happen to me. Okay? I mean, you've never heard that before? No one's ever pointed to you and said, you know, it's all your fault, right? Okay? Right. So that's what happens, okay? Now, what does the woman say?
It's a serpent fault.
It's a serpent's fault. I mean, actually, she's technically correct. But what she says is important for what we understand to happen next. Because then God issues punishment. He curses the land and he curses the serpent. He does not curse the male and the female. Instead, he provides what the Hebrew text, what the Hebrew principle is, measure for measure, right? And in order to understand what happens to Eve, we must understand how it first affects Adam. So let's think really carefully about the punishment that God provides for Adam. Tell me exactly what it is. He is to do what?
Got to work hard on the land.
He's what?
Got to work hard to.
He's now going to have to toil. The word is atzav. He's now going to have to bring forth bread from the land with sorrow, because thistles and thorns are going to grow up. So now let me ask you this. Does God change Adam's prime directive? No, he doesn't, does he? He doesn't say, oh, you know what? You blew it. Now I'm going to have you be a seafarer and you're just going to have to fish for a living. Is that what he says? No. He says your job is still the same. You still have to tend the earth. You still have to steward the earth. You still have to provide work, worship, and service together. But now it's going to be more difficult. Why? Because the Adamah that you came from, Adam, will resist you. It will fight against you. Before, it was designed to bless you. So, remember when the spies went into the land of Canaan, right? They came back with a grapevine that was so big it took 2 men to carry. Why? Did they plant those grapes? No, because the promised land is bountiful, because that's the way God designed the land to be. He designed it to produce in fecundity, because it's supposed to do that. And in the Garden of Eden, it works the way it's supposed to. So it's bountiful. It just takes a little bit of tending, and everything comes forth as it's supposed to, right? But now, as a result of the mistake that Adam made, right? As a result of the sin, the land resists him. It still is going to produce, but now it's going to take toil, not just work. Okay? This is really important, because what it suggests is that the source of Adam becomes the resistance of Adam. He comes from the ground, and the ground is going to fight him. Okay? That's measure for measure. Where I came from is now the thing that fights against me. Okay, now let's go look at the curse, supposedly. Let's go look at the punishment that God gives Ahavah. And for that, you have to see it in Hebrew. Here it is. Transliterated, of course. Okay? This is the way we usually translate the text. El ha'isha amar harab arbe. Okay? So you see here, El ha'isha. God says to the woman, Amar ha'isha, the woman. This is the way we translate usually. These two words are the same word, just like akatokel, mut. This word is translated greatly increase. So the way that the thing is translated usually is, and God said to the woman, I will greatly increase your pain in childbearing. Right? That's the way we translate it.